to everybody for coming on what is quite a horrible day late in term. It's really good to see how many people are interested in this topic. So I don't think I'm going to need to introduce the topic particularly, as we can all see. The title is Colonial Legacies. How does colonialism affect modern development challenges? As most of us will know, because most of us will have some background in economics, or at least have encountered it, economics is fairly notorious for not exactly taking full account of the historical context to which it is being applied. And in the case of development economics, as a subset of economics, a big part of that historical context is colonialism. And this affects virtually every element of the things which economics is trying to describe and discuss, and the things which development in general is trying to discuss, be it political and legal institutions, be it social institutions, be it virtually everything that affects how our economic policies are actually going to turn out in the real world. And it's largely absent. So today we have two fantastic speakers who are going to talk about this, hopefully introduces some really interesting ideas. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Shailaja Fennell. She's here in the development faculty. She lectures for development, particularly in institutions and development, and also the comparative development of India and China, which I think we're about to hear something about today, or at least India and Pakistan. And then her research interests are extremely broad, so they include everything from legal institutional change to agriculture to gender and education. So she should be able to give us a really nice broad set of views on this particular topic. And our second speaker is going to be Dr. Jason Hickel. He's joining us from the LSE. He has a background in anthropology. He's a consultant on African affairs. He writes regularly for The Guardian and also for Al Jazeera. And he has very broad research interests, everything from global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to aid, to the way Western liberal values are sort of being the uptake of Western liberal values in rural communities in South Africa. And again, hugely broad, should be able to give a really, really interesting introduction to this topic. So I'm going to stop waffling. If you can all put your hands together and invite our first speaker, Dr. Fennell, to speak.
Thank you, Jacob. It's a pleasure to speak to an audience on this subject, and I think there are three particular reasons I accepted. One, because for my sins I too trained as an economist, and I think it's really important for economists in the 21st century to reconsider the way they themselves are somewhat imperialist in other disciplines, and therefore take terminology from other disciplines but not willing to go the full hog. So elsewhere in my courses and institutions, we look at those who argue, such as Asimoglu, Johnson Robinson, the paper they wrote, in which they said, yes, colonialism matters because it affects future development. But colonialism is a variable that you run a regression on. So I'm going to demur from that kind of presentation, and I'm going to look at colonialism in a very located way, look particularly at issues about education and how they intertwine with religion and caste in India and Pakistan in the modern period. And I'm going to make the case that this is linked to the way colonial legacies are both understood and replayed at the end of the 20th century. The second reason that I am very happy to talk here is because education itself, at the moment, very pleasantly surprising in this university, is receiving attention through the decolonizing of the curriculum lectures. And the decolonization discussion itself is very powerful, particularly at a time where for many a sort of quick and nasty route through decolonization is forms of extreme nationalism. And right way to talk about it, we have Trump, 2 years ago in India we had Modi. It is a way to try and understand how societies make sense of what is theirs and what is in other countries. And colonialism has a very particularly extreme way of us and them. And that inheritance is something I want to talk about. And third, and most particularly, these late 20th, early 21st versions of interpretations of colonialism are taking place in a very market-oriented, globalized, neoliberal environment. And in particular, I will be looking at the rise of private schooling. The next speaker obviously is much more well-versed in Africa, but I only want to start with what shocked me this year, and that is, even after 20 years in development, was Liberia outsourcing educational policy to the Bridge Academy. The way in which countries who have come out of colonialism and become independent still feel overwhelmed and unprepared to deliver the fundamental aspects of education in a country was the third reason I felt it was important to make a statement today. So I will keep to my 25 minutes, and here we go. So I'm going to start with certain stylized facts that become evident at the end of the 20th century. And I'm going to talk in particular about social features, not economic features, to make the case that economics is, in a Polanyian sense, very much a consequence of social relations. And at the end of the 20th century, certain features about India's, South Asia's caste system. For those of you who are unaware of caste, it's a hierarchical system which for some is an occupational classification. So if you don't know about caste, it's like thinking about European feudalism, the priest class on the top, the king below, the merchants and everybody who's a peasant. Think Monty Python. So that could be occupational structure, but in South Asian context, it also has a religious connotation because it becomes a form of reproduction. So at the end of the 20th century, looking back at the colonial and the post-colonial predicament, a lot of South Asian writers are making the argument that actually the crystallization of the caste system was a consequence of the colonial encounter. I just want to talk about what that means. The argument is that in the 1870s, when the British in India decided they want to conduct their censuses, the first census in 1871, they classified people by caste and occupation. And the argument, for example, Susan Bailey, who's here, a professor in the anthropology department, made in her classic work on caste, her argument was once you create a census, you codify and you categorize people. So the argument is caste existed before colonialism, but caste before colonialism was more fluid and becomes more classified after the creation of the census. And that work has been taken by Deshpande and Sundar and others, and they talk about the distinction between a community practice of caste. Caste is practiced in communities, and then the formal religious identity. And the argument is, what does a categorization of caste do? Well, if you are a native population that's classified, and the classic tropes are the Punjabi is therefore the soldier, the Bengali is therefore the clerk, and so across India, regional identities get transformed into particular occupations to support the British in the second half of the 19th century. Well, this is history, and I was told by Jacob, don't talk about history. I wish I could say this is a historical past and it's disappeared. The point I want to make is that it hasn't. At the end of the 20th century, so the turn of the millennium, we still get caste. But caste today, and Bete and Dipankar Gupta and others have said more recently, that this caste, the caste identities in modern society, are not the caste identities of the past. They're not the occupational caste. They're new ways of a language, of exclusivity. I'm better than you. Us and them, but in your own society. And so caste is a mobility strategy for those who have privilege. And they use it as a way to not just ride the market, but go ahead of the market. So it's like an exclusive club. I belong to a group of merchants, so I'm better than the group of people who don't have land. And I'll use that to create social networks. Networks of marriage, networks of housing. There are parts of India in which it matters what caste you are in terms of whether you will get housing. And if I add to this mixed religion, because caste is a form of religious marker, if you're a Muslim in India, there are many parts of Bombay cities which will not rent accommodation to you. So in modern India, caste and religion intertwine. And why am I saying caste in South Asia? Because every religious community in South Asia has converted at some point or has come into contact with Hinduism. So you have caste in Islam, in South Asia, not in other parts. You have caste in Buddhism. People recognize caste from your names and where you come from. You have caste in Sikhism. And for those of you who are from this part of the world, recently we've had discussions in Parliament whether caste should be identified as a feature under British law, as a form of discrimination. And so sometimes it's good to laugh. A recent cartoon in the Wall Street Journal, this tech support person says she hopes I'm a caste she can talk to. Now clearly in a meritocratic modern society, why the heck does caste matter? And that's the puzzle that I want to unpick. And to do that, I want to take one step back into history to take two steps forward in the 21st century. So as early as the 19th century, there's a shift in colonial policy between what was till the mid-19th century East India Company holdings. India only becomes part of Her Majesty's Empire in 1862. Victoria ascends as Empress of India in 1862. So the first 100 years of Indian colonialism formally recognized from the time of East India Company is under company rule. And under company rule, religion was not part, education was not part. It was a trading company. They traded with India, they acquired land, they became landowners, but they were not concerned with educational policy. And for those of you thinking in conceptual terms, the difference between mercantilism and what follows later, which is formal colonialism. When colonialism comes in, and preceding that, the debates around whether the crown should take control, the idea of educating the Indian population to serve as an intermediary, the top end of the Indian elites to serve as the intermediary between the small British population that comes as part of the administration and the large Indian native population is something that's very interesting. And I will talk in a minute of the particular moment of shift. It's around a bill of Macaulay called the Minute of 1835, which makes the argument for the first time not only should Western education be given to Indian natives, but this is a process by which English, and I want to talk particularly about English and Western education, English being regarded as Western education often in early 20th century in India and Pakistan, as a way of othering. So English is sort of Western, is secular, and native is somehow traditional and non-secular. And recently there's been debates, particularly with scholars in this country looking at British records and talking about this presumption that religion is devoid of any role in Western thought is a question. Because, and Seth makes a very nice point about what is this? Is this about the church entering India? And I won't enter that debate, but it's an interesting point to put aside. But the historical antecedents are interesting, as I said, because in South Asia you get this particular twist, which is very present today, that modern education somehow is a British invention. And that's hugely problematic in a country like India or Pakistan, where mass education is only now being achieved, for very different levels of mass education. So you have the elite schools where English is taught, which are global players. You have people who are coming for the first time through the Millennium Development Goals to get education in poor quality schools. Some of these are government, some of these are private. But this bizarre, and in the post 9/11 world, this idea that Western is English and others is not, has peculiarities in terms of the education process. So here is Macaulay's method. It did the following. It established English as a common language in India, but it categorically said that rational thinking is only a product of English education. That Indian systems of education, mired in Indian religions, whether Mohammedan or Hindu, as they call at the time, were irrational bias. And therefore, while it created an Indian class that could speak English, they did not only become the via media between the British and the larger Indian population, they also became, as sometimes said, the brown sahibs. They became imitators of, and therefore, in the post-colonial moment, are regarded as conspirators against, supporting the colonial masters rather than being part of it. Okay. So, using that, I want to move to the 21st century and to some studies that we conducted in both countries to show, from the macro context, what we have had in the 50 years, 60 years between independence 47 to the 20th century end, is we've had some very odd educational policies. In terms of a national policy of education, you would presume that nation building would be the focus of countries. And that should have been driven by mass education. All kids should have gone to school. And for those of you who've been following the Millennium Development Goals or not, India's enrollment rates before the Millennium Development Goals, number of children registered to go to school at age 5, was in the order of the 80s. And India's success rate of retaining them to finish at the age of 16 or 18 was less than 40-50%. So it's a fall. Today, in the post-Millennium Development Goals, you've got 99% enrollment and possibly closer to 80% or 77% retention. It's a shift, but it's taken a good 60 years. Well, why is that odd? Well, because if you think about India's, here's the only economic data you've got. If you look at India's budget and Pakistan's budget since 1947 to 2000, they've spent much more on tertiary education, which has 10% of the population. 10% of the population in Pakistan and India go to college. That has had more money spent on it than primary and secondary education. So it gives you an idea of this continuity between Macaulay's Minute in 1835 that gets adopted as educational policy in the 19th century, right through to the 21st century. where you have investment in promoting an elite class. And I could have told this story for Ghana and Kenya. In most of the British colonies, the continuity, notwithstanding the strong nationalist demand for education, is an inordinate investment in tertiary education compared to the primary and secondary sector. And these opposing tendencies have caused some amount of befuddlement, because even at the sub-national level, so both in India and Pakistan, like in many other large countries in the developing world, you have a system of federalism. So you have a central government and you have states or provinces, and education is often administered at the sub-national level. And in both India and Pakistan, notwithstanding this idea of nationalism, education being a national subject, there's a strong introduction at sub-national level of religious tendencies, be they Islamic tendencies in Pakistan or Islamic or Hindu tendencies in India. So we've had a very odd shift, moving away from secular education for all to high-level education for a few and something for the rest. And that gap has been filled by other players. And these new private providers are not like the state. The state provides education, it's middling education. A lot of elites go to top-end private schools, but for those who don't manage the education system, these new providers, they're called low-fee private schools in the literature. They are odd, because they seem to be a mix of religious and secular. Now you could say, how's that possible? Post-independent Pakistan and India are, in terms of their constitution, set out as countries that give education to all their subjects. And so what I want to do with this case study, if I may, Jacob, in the remaining part of my presentation, is to use material that we collected, both through quantitative and qualitative data, to ask this difficult question. Should religion and education be regarded as opposing forces? And do they represent the 2 points of tradition and modernity? And we will look at commentaries coming from parents, head teachers, on public schools, by which I mean not public schools in England, as in government schools, state schools, private or community schools. They could be madrasa schools, they can be local institutions, and try and understand how the poor, who have only recently got access to education, understand this binary. And maybe that will explain why we can't regard colonialism as a single moment that changed in 1947. So the micro context is work we did in 4 countries. Today talking about India and Pakistan, but I said Ghana and Kenya could equally be the story. And it's this binary, modern is secular and tradition is religious, that I want to address. And we did, as I said, interview a number of people. We wanted the parental or the demand side view, as the economists like to call it, and the provider or the supply side. The methodology was district-based research. We had urban and rural sites. We wanted to know, is the class and rural-urban divide? Urban people are modern and rural people aren't. And we had a number of schools. Here's the data. But very quickly, the findings, the summary findings. The findings are puzzling. It looks like in both Pakistan and India, it's not Pakistan is an outlier, they're much more religious. In both countries, there seems to be a permeable separation. What is religious and what is secular are there, but they seem to fuse together for these new providers, as well as for these new families who are accessing education, who haven't had an elite understanding, who haven't been part of the top half of these two societies. So the first of 2 sites I'm going to look at is Alwar. Alwar is in Rajasthan. And it's a particularly puzzling site because it had, before the Millennium Development Goals, the highest level of child labour in India. Not just in Rajasthan, in India. Which means you have lots of very poor children who are working in brick kilns or other things. And one of the places that people like Shailaja Fennell worked in to try and get children out. For those of you, again, who are not familiar with South Asian context, SC is scheduled caste. That means the people who are in the bottom end of caste society. And ST is scheduled tribes. So you have those who are considered to be non-agricultural based, opposed to pastoral or other groups, they're scheduled tribes. They're the bottom of India's caste category. And the school attendance for those kids before the Millennium Development Goals, 1994, was 58-21. That's boys and girls. So there's a gendered feature here as well in terms of what colonialism does in terms of, and the improvement that occurs through that period, but you know, hey, 65 is better than 49, but it's not 100%. So religion and education is something that everybody talks about. The constitution in India certainly doesn't regard religion as a feature, but it's there in the lives of these young people. Not because they choose it, but that is the reality. So one of the things that urban government schools have done, urban, not so much in rural, is they've reduced caste-based discrimination. And one of the quotes is, does not occur now. When I was in the village, this is a teacher, a Rajput village, this is a middle to top caste category, in a Jat village, in a Sikh village, children were treated differently. But in my current school, everybody drinks water. Now this may be puzzling. In caste-based village communities, the lowest caste cannot drink water from the same water sense as the upper caste. Dalits, or scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, are not considered clean. They will not be able to drink from the same well, for example. But that doesn't occur in the school anymore. The fact that they're stating it doesn't occur in the school means up to this point, up to the point we did our survey in 2005 to 2010, this occurred in schools. Just an idea of the long-lasting legacy of the idea of caste. Caste as a category. Girls' school. Is it any different in girls or boys? Here the argument is all children come to our school. The reason, of course, all children come is the poorest children. It's a government school, they can't afford private, but everyone has now enrolled in school. So maybe they drink water from different places in rural, but at least they're in school. Maybe the next stage is they'll all drink water from the same tap. Here is the view of these teachers when they teach minorities. And here I've got two types of minorities, the Mohammedans, i.e. Muslim families, the Gujars, these are scheduled tribes, roaming tribes or pastoralists who come and go. The equivalent in England would be the idea of migrant communities, the new settlers, people who move. Right? Among Mohammed and Gujar, they enroll their school children in private school because they think it's going to improve their chance of marriage. Now, the fact that these relatively low-income groups are going to school is not regarded by the teachers because they are clever, it's because they want better marriage prospects. So you can improve your school chances, but the upper caste still regard it as you're not doing this for economic advantage, you're doing this for social advantage. I'm not saying that's wrong, I'm saying think about it. The fact that low caste communities are choosing private schools to signal some kind of social mobility is really interesting. And of course, again, generalization. The Mohammedans always marry their children off when they reach adolescence. When we did a survey, we found all poor communities married their children off at adolescence. But the fact that head teacher felt that it was particularly relevant for Mohammedans or Muslim families is indication of that social difference. So low-fee private schools seem to have more children from upper class, except for these exceptions. So these private schools that have come in to fill the gap of poor quality government schools. And okay, this is very interesting. So Lakshman Public School is not a public school. It's not a government school. It's a low-fee school. This is the name it gives itself. Now Lakshman, for those of you who don't know, is the brother of the god called Rama. I think there's a god called Rama. And so they give themselves this name because it's kind of a high caste status name. Lakshman Public School. And so they're trying to get lower caste people. They haven't got SC/SC, they've got the middle caste. We are able to get in touch with the OBC families. The Rajputs, the Brahmins, and the Guptas. There's some Harijans, but they're very small. But actually the 15% of the population. So here you can see that kind of Bourdieu's notion of social reproduction. We want to get some people who are deserving, but we want to maintain status. So, this is my favorite. Okay, so look at the name of the school. Shri Himmat Singh Yadav Convent Public School. I could have chosen this if I wanted to make it up myself. So, here, I'm going to deconstruct that for you. Sir Himmat Singh Yadav is Sir, so that's relating to colonialism, English, what have you. Himmat Singh means somebody who's brave. He was in the army. He's a Yadav, so he's a good caste. Convent Public School. The word convent means they teach English. But when we were in the school, there was no English taught anywhere. This is a branding by the school saying, we're modern and we are traditional. We've got all these traditions. We've got Sir, we've got the Colonial, we've got Sir Himmat Singh Yadav, we've got the nationalist element, but convent, we're modern, we're English. And there were so many schools like this that we came to where convent is a symbol of the neoliberal idea of English education. As distinct from Sir, which is the old idea of colonial education. Okay. So is educational inclusion underway in the Indian case? And I'll just move to the case of Pakistan in a moment. Breaking down the structural basis of SCST appears to be registered But when it comes to scholarships, the upper caste have closer social distance. They are less distant from the teachers, so they get the scholarships because they know about them. It's not that the poorer kids can't get it, but you've got to go in there and get it, and social distance means that upper castes do better. And here's the story for Punjab, not dissimilar. So Sargodha in Punjab is a district very close to the capital, Lahore. And here, a father, so giving you the parental view, he argues the situation, and this is between private school and public school. He says, there's not much difference on paper, but what really I want to see, whether it's a public school or private school, is the relationship with the teacher and the student. So this father studied till bachelor, so he's educated, he's in rural Sargodha, and he says, and here's the important thing, he says, he's talking about religious education, he's sending his children to a school, and he's saying, because, as in terms of the religious leaders, every person has three fathers. The first father is the one who gives him birth. The second is the one who gives you an education. And the third is the one who gives you a livelihood. Now, if this is not an informed, careful decision of a father who's using religious language, but talking about education as something he wants to give his children, Hazrat Ali said, give me an education, he showed me light, and is the way to heaven. And this father educated all his girls to school. He said they should become teachers, because then they will do the same thing. So he's not saying my daughter should go out there and work as engineers, but they will be good life givers. So it's an interesting notion of the poor trying to mediate between religion and modernity to try and get better education. Head teacher, he says, the matter with government schools is that they cannot reach the poor people. That's because there's a high level of corruption. And this is the people. The people here means the bureaucrats. The reason government schools are bad is money is being siphoned away. And again, the language of a teacher talking about education, but using the language of religion. They don't know the difference between what is permissible, halal, and what is not, haram. So he's saying it's the bureaucrats who are corrupt. We want education, they are corrupt. But to talk about corruption, he's using the language of religion. Okay? And then they talk about the need to increase education. People should be more aware. Very clear. Half a century is a long time for any nation. 2 generations have grown up in this period. They may not have a voice in the political world. They might be able to demand education, but they're very aware of the value or the cost of not having education. Again, nationalism. We must ensure education undertakes and makes us a good Pakistani, a good Muslim. So, there are concerns among head teachers. Okay, this is the one that may amuse you or may not. Their concerns are not about whether something religious or secular, it's how to get a good result. And what shocked us in all 4 countries, and we just put it here, is we are not allowed to hit a student. According to them, the reason government schools do badly is not because they're secular or religious, it's because you have to beat a child to make it safe. Now, from the societies where we come from, where beating a child is not important. This is the kind of structural violence that the poor are subjected to, which is very different from the notions of neoliberalism. You get educated, you get a job, your life is better. So, my last 2 slides. Are these binaries? Are we still in the world where secular and traditional are different? And I would like to argue there's a new shifting of positions on this. There's a determination among head teachers that they don't care if it's a private or state school. The important thing is to instill the correct principles in their children. And that's a composite mixture of nationalism and Islam. And we may find that uncomfortable. And they trace it right back, as you can see from the quotes, to independence. And they're very sensitive. Huge quotes about, we study, we're not the terrorists. It's the rich people who become terrorists. Now, this may not be true, or it could be the way they see their lives, but very powerful narratives about how they see the world. So I'm arguing that we need to reconsider the binaries of secular and religious. These were devised by the national elite at the beginning of independence, the literature I've showed you before. But we need to look at the new engagements, where the poor are accessing education show a considerable overlap. As do the private providers, Sir Himmat Singh Yadav, convent school. And the development thinking that we have need to understand that English education means modernity. But do these people have that English education that's going to take them forward? And do better educational providers is the private sector. These low-field schools are private schools. They are getting profits. Is that really going to provide better quality education? So as I started, I end. In the new complexities of globalization, international players and donors, and how they meet or don't meet the aspirations of poor and urban communities, lies the future of Pakistan and India. Thank you.
Do you want to ask questions now, or do you want to?
I think we'll have both speakers and we'll do questions at the end.
Okay.
You definitely don't need slides. You don't need slides.
I'm going to put some slides up just in case. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's better than this one when it looks like some slides. Eden, could you log me back in? That's all right.
Hopefully we won't put you to sleep here. So my ethnographic research is focused in South Africa. I'm from Swaziland, so it's very close to home for me. And my work is actually focused quite a lot on the legacy of colonialism and apartheid and shaping the kind of landscape politically that people in development have to engage today in Southern Africa. But I thought that today, because this question was so provocative, I thought that I would try to give a provocative answer that is not based on my core research, but rather draws a bit more broadly from the literature and speaks more broadly about the impact of colonialism. And to do that, I'm going to actually talk a bit about history. I didn't realize we were not supposed to, so bear with me for that, but only because I want to make a point about how the present works. So for me, one of the things that has always kind of troubled me about Western development discourse is how infrequently it acknowledges the history of colonialism. For decades, reports from the World Bank and DFID and USAID and other similar agencies have represented poverty and underdevelopment as though they have no history, as though they occur on islands disconnected from the rich world, as though the fortunes of the West and the misfortunes of the rest have nothing to do with one another. If colonialism is acknowledged, it is often to say in a tone dismissive of dissent, it was beneficial to the colonies, that it somehow helped boost them up the development ladder. And in popular discourse, this claim is inevitably followed by that classic piece of so-called evidence. Look, we gave them the railroads. But historians tell us a very different story. And if we look at the record more closely, it becomes clear that Europe didn't develop the colonies at all. The colonies developed Europe, and were themselves de-developed by Europe in the process. When the first of the conquistadors set foot on what is now Latin America, the continent had an indigenous population of about 100 million people. By the mid-1600s, their numbers had been slashed to 3.5 million. So in other words, some 95% of the indigenous population had been killed off during this time. Many of them, as we know, succumbed to European diseases, and many were slain, I guess more directly, in outright massacres. But also a major driver of increasing mortality and the collapse of social reproduction was the fact that Europeans destroyed the livelihoods of indigenous communities by pushing them off their lands, and quite often into forced labor. And it was precious metal that the Europeans were after, and they got it. During the Holocaust of indigenous South America, the Spanish pulled 100 million kilograms of silver out of the continent's mountains and shipped it to Europe. To get a sense for the scale of this wealth, consider this. What if 100 million kilograms of silver was invested in 1800 at the historically average rate of interest? It it would amount to about 165 trillion US dollars today, which is more than twice the world's total GDP. Spain transferred much of this treasure to its creditors in England, as we know, and 19th century historians argued that this stockpile of wealth provided the initial capital for Britain's industrialization. Of course, we know now that it was much more complex than that. The real benefit of all of that colonial plunder was that it allowed Britain to trade with the East, importing land-intensive goods and natural resources that, being a crowded and ecologically degraded island, it lacked the capacity to provide for itself. Kenneth Pomerantz, a historian at the University of Chicago, refers to this as the ecological windfall. He argues that this windfall was essential to allowing England to grow its economy beyond its natural limits at the time. Outsourcing land-intensive production also allowed Britain to reallocate its labor into capital-intensive industrial activities, which other states did not have the luxury of doing. Right? Now, of course, the New World was not only a source of precious metals, it was also a source of sugar and cotton, grown on plantations powered by the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans. By 1853, 15 million of them had been shipped across the Atlantic. Historian Walter Rodney famously described this as an enormous transfer of value from the continent of Africa to Western states. We know, for example, that the United States alone benefited from a total of 222 million hours of forced slave labor, valued at the US minimum wage with a modest rate of interest. That is worth 97 trillion US dollars today. And that's to say nothing of the value produced by slave labor in Latin America and the Caribbean. But again, the real benefit that Europe derived from the slave economy was that it provided yet another ecological windfall. Sugar came to account for 22% of the calories that Britain consumed, which reduced pressure on domestic agricultural production and freed up labor for industrial pursuits. Cotton provided a key raw material for Britain's industrial revolution, and without diverting land from food production or straining Europe's labor capacities. And if we add timber to cotton and sugar, then we see that the New World contributed some 30 million ghost acres of productive land to Britain alone, which was double the size of Britain's own arable land. Okay? Pomerantz argues that these slave-produced imports, timber and sugar and cotton, were one of the single largest factors in spurring Europe's industrialization. So in this sense, too, without the colonies of the New World, Europe's industrialization would have been impossible. Something similar, of course, happened with British India. Once the British consolidated their power over the subcontinent, their primary intervention was to reorganize the farming system. They completely upended existing subsistence practices by ending tenure rights and privatizing economies, not unlike the enclosure movement that the British elites visited upon their own people just one generation prior. The goal was to transform India into an exporter of agricultural commodities to be shipped to London, and they succeeded. Between 1875 and 1900, grain exports were as high as 10 million tons per year, a huge windfall for Britain, which could not provide enough food itself to slate the needs of its urban consumers. But India didn't fare so well. Just as the enclosure movement created mass poverty in Britain, the same thing happens with enclosure in India. Stripped of their rights to common lands and water, huge swathes of the population succumbed to famine. 30 million Indians died of starvation in what historian Mike Davis has called the late Victorian Holocaust. How much is 30 million people? Laid head to foot, their corpses would stretch the length of England, from Portsmouth to Carlisle, 85 times over. British colonizers didn't stop at turning India into an exporter of grain and raw materials. They also sought to remake the country as a consumer of Britain's manufactured goods. But to do this, they faced an uphill battle. India already had many strong industries of its own, including a textile industry that was considered by many to be one of the best in the world. To prevent Indian manufacturers from competing with British exporters, the colonizers resorted to force. In one famous episode, they went about crushing the fingers and burning the looms of some of India's most talented weavers. They then imposed policies that prevented Indians from becoming skilled artisans in many cases. And most importantly, they imposed a series of what we call one-way tariffs. Britain protected its domestic market with high taxes on Indian imports, but struck down Indian tariff walls to ensure Britain's ease of access to India's markets. And these are what we call unequal treaties. And it worked. India, once self-sufficient and famous for its exports, was remade into the world's biggest captive market for British goods. And the economic transformation was dramatic. Before the British arrived, India commanded 27% of the global economy in terms of GDP. By the time the British left, India's share had shrunk to only 3%. During the entire colonial period in India, there was no increase in per capita income. And that's from the time the East India Company took power in 1757 to the time of national independence nearly 200 years later. In fact, during the last half of the 19th century, the heyday of British intervention, average income in India declined by more than 50%. And it was not just incomes that collapsed. From 1872 to 1921, the average life expectancy of Indians fell by 20%. In other words, the subcontinent was effectively de-developed. And we can see the same pattern in the colonial world more broadly. Between 1870 and 1913, per capita income in both Asia and Africa together grew at only 0.5%. By contrast, Western Europe grew at about 4 times this rate or more. Having restructured the global economy in their favor, creating a kind of world system that fed the core from the periphery, Europeans increased their share of global GDP from 20% to 60% during the colonial period, while the colonies themselves plunged into crisis. So I consider this history to be important for our understanding of contemporary development challenges in 3 ways. First, we need to recognize that colonialism laid the groundwork for the global division of labor that continues to exist today, with developing countries dependent to varying degrees on exports of primary commodities and imports of Western manufacturers, in broad strokes. The problem with this arrangement is not only that it prevents autonomous developments, it also generates inequality. During the 20th century, the terms of trade worked against the South, as the prices of their commodity exports decreased relative to the prices of the manufactured goods they imported. In other words, they had to spend more to get less, which translated and continues to translate into an outward net transfer of wealth, mitigated somewhat by the commodity boom recently, but that's beginning to collapse. Second, we need to recognize that the very same tactics that characterize the colonial agenda, namely the imposition of unfair trade rules for the sake of accessing resources and markets, remain in play today. To understand how this works, we need to continue the story into the second half of the 20th century. And this will be familiar to many of you. But after the end of colonialism, the countries of the Global South began to take control of their own economic policies. So during the 1950s and 1960s, they made strategic use of tariffs, import substitution, land reform, and nationalization in order to build their industrial strength and ensure that their citizens benefited from national wealth, and not just foreigners. They were employing the very same policies that the West had used in their own industrial developments, and it worked remarkably well. During this period, these 2 decades, per capita income growth was at about 3.2% per year. And for the first time in history, the gap between the South and the North began to narrow, which is quite an important point historically. So it was kind of post-colonial miracle. And you would think that Western states, being committed to the idea, to the theory of development at the time, as they claimed to be, would be happy about this. But in fact, they were very upset, as they were losing their access to resources and consumer markets in the Global South, which they had enjoyed under colonialism. And so they fought back, initially kind of in a piecemeal manner. You'll know about the coups that deposed democratically elected leaders across the Global South, like Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and the Congo, for example, right? And there's many more. But they couldn't stop this movement of that had been building among third world states for kind of the South-South solidarity and a demand for a fairer global economic system. In the 1970s, Global South countries had actually begun to back an agreement at the UN demanding that the West allow them simply to decide their own economic policies, hardly a radical demand. But the movement was finally crushed in the 1980s, and it all had to do with the third world debt crisis. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this. But basically, here's kind of the story in a nutshell. In 1981, the US Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates massively as part of the domestic economic strategy. And so interest rates soared from quite low to up to as high as 20%. And developing countries whose debt was denominated in US dollars suddenly found themselves unable to repay their loans. And so they slid to the brink of default, beginning with Mexico in 1982. And this was a huge crisis in the global economy at the time. Because US banks noticed that if the global south debtors defaulted, it would cause the Western financial system to basically collapse, as the banks were heavily overexposed. Debt. And so it's very similar actually to what happened in 2008 with overexposure to climate debt. So the US government decided to step in to sort of save the banks. The plan was to use the IMF to roll over developing country loans, but in exchange, endowed countries would have to submit to what were called structural adjustment programs. And again, this is probably familiar news to many of you. These programs kind of included like a three-part cocktail. First was fiscal austerity, forcing countries to cut state spending on public services like healthcare and education, okay? And then funneling those budget line items into debt repayments. Also cutting government subsidies on infant industry, for example, also on farming and food. And again, pushing those line items into debt repayments. Also the privatization of the public sector, reversing the nationalization that many global south countries had engaged during the 50s and 60s. And again, using that income to repay debts. Virtually taking money out of the mouths of some of the world's poorest people and using it to rescue the Western banking system. And it also included, crucially, the forced liberalization of markets, right? So the beginning of of globalization in the true sense. They forced global south countries to cut their trade tariffs to allow Western goods in, allow Western companies to operate in them, and they also forced them to cut price controls and subsidies and other kinds of protections like that. And by doing so, the North Atlantic powers were able to successfully regain their control over the former colonial world, but this time without overt colonization. So through the imbrication of debt and structural adjustment, control over economic decisions in the South was shifted from the parliaments of sovereign nations to technocrats in Washington and bankers in New York and London. It's interesting to consider, for me, the implications of this new form of remote control power. Structural adjustment marked the end of national economic sovereignty only 2 decades after global South countries gained their independence from colonialism. So that period of real independence was very, very brief. And this fact was not lost on the leaders of the South at the time. Thomas Sankara, the president of Burkina Faso in the 80s, in a famous speech to the African Union, pointed out that debt functioned as a new form of colonialism. And he argued that real independence could only be achieved if southern countries went ahead and defaulted. Okay. Keep in mind, he said to his colleagues, if we don't repay the debt, the big banks will hurt, but no one will die. If we do repay the debt, then we will surely die. His words sparked the kind of debt resistance movement across the continent. And in return, he was assassinated in a French-backed coup, only months after his speech, killed for daring to question this new emerging colonial order based on debt. And that was a lesson to any of his colleagues who were considering similar moves. And Sankara turned out to be correct in his prediction. The IMF insisted that structural adjustment would help stimulate the economies of poor countries and help them develop. But exactly the opposite happens. Instead of helping poor countries, structural adjustment virtually destroyed them. Per capita income growth in the developing world was cut dramatically during the 80s and 90s, from 3.2% down to 0.7%, virtually plunging into the crisis. Economists calculate that the global South lost an average of $480 billion per year in potential income through GDP during the 1980s and 1990s as a result of structural adjustment. Now that's more than 5 times the amount that they were receiving in aid each year during the exact same period, right? Giving a kind of lie to the whole discourse of aid. In Africa, this is particularly bad, and I was alive during these years. In Africa, average GNP shrank during the 80s and 90s by 10%. The number of people in absolute poverty doubled, even according to the World Bank's lowest possible poverty line. So the key point I want to make here is that while the colonial era is technically over, some of the key tactics of colonialism remain in play today. And the development industry, because it ignores the role of colonial history in the creation of underdevelopments and global inequality, fails to see how the logic of colonialism continues to impact the challenges it seeks to tackle. Finally, there's a third reason I want to cover about why we need to consider the legacy of colonialism when it comes to contemporary development challenges, and it has to do with climate change. I've argued that the ecological windfalls and captive markets that that colonialism provided were essential to the industrialization of Europe. And okay, so that process of plunder, slavery, and unequal tariffs and so on wreaked havoc on the colonies. But so too were the effects of Europe's industrialization. So we know that from the start of the Industrial Revolution until today, humans have released a total of about 588 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Rich industrial economies, such as our own, are responsible for about 70% of this. Yet, according to data from the Climate Vulnerability Monitor, these same nations bear only 12% of the total cost of climate change. Developing countries, by contrast, bear 82% of the total costs, which right now is about $570 to $600 billion in losses due to droughts, floods, landslides, storms, and wildfires each year. And as climate change worsens and these costs continue to increase, the share of losses borne by the Global South will also increase, we're told, to about 92% by 2030. And by then, losses are projected to be in the region of $954 billion per year. Okay. So for the sake of comparison, note that this sum is roughly 10 times what the developing world receives in aid every year. In other words, for every dollar of aid that the Global South receives from the North, they lose $10 due to climate change caused by those very same donors. As I see it, these figures make a kind of mockery of the development industry and its claims. And this is to say nothing of the loss of human life that's at stake. These same reports suggest that around 500,000 people die each year due to climate change-related causes. 98% of those deaths occur in the Global South. And the vast majority happen in the countries on the planet that have produced the fewest historical emissions. Right now, we're on course for global warming of about 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Right? It's very difficult to predict what the world will look like under these conditions. But even conservative projections suggest that agricultural productivity in many key regions of the Global South could fall by up to 50%. Okay. So given this, it will likely trigger mass famine and human displacements. And we can expect that such a scenario will more than reverse all of the gains in poverty reduction and life expectancy that have been accomplished by the development interventions over the past half-century. One could argue that there's a direct link between the history of colonialism and the unevenly distributed consequences of contemporary climate change. And this argument is particularly important when it comes to assessing the climate debts that the North owes to the South. In other words, the share of the burden of emissions reduction that the North should bear, and the amount they need to transfer to the South in order to compensate for the climate change-related damage they have caused. Such reparations can be calculated actually with exacting precision, since we know precisely how much each country has contributed to global CO2 emissions. We know what needs to be done. According to Professor Kevin Anderson, who is one of the UK's leading climate scientists, if we were to have any hope of staying below 2 degrees of warming, rich countries will have to reduce their emissions by about 8% per year, starting last year and all the way up until 2050 when we reach net zero. Because this rate of reduction cannot be achieved by technological innovation alone, which will only accomplish about 4% reduction, this kind of reduction will require a strategic downscaling of unnecessary production and consumption in rich countries. That's the fact we have to face up to. Of course, rich countries have refused to accept this science. The emissions reduction pledges made by the major historical polluters like the US and the UK at Paris fall dreadfully short of what we need them to do. Voices from the Global South have been calling foul, but their cries have fallen on deaf ears. Nothing, it appears, can be allowed to stop the West's march to ever-increasing consumption, regardless of the consequences it has. And this is where we can see yet another key piece of colonial logic coming into play. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, colonial powers considered their colonies to be a sacrifice zone for the sake of their own development. No loss of human life, no amount of human suffering, no degree of ecological degradation was too much, so long as Europe's economic interests were served. And of course, there was a racial logic to this madness. The raw inequity that this system produced was justified by the fact that people with brown and black skin were considered not quite as human as those with white. Right? Like animals, their suffering mattered less. So too with climate change. With the uneven consequences of global warming, the South is being rendered once again a sacrifice zone. That old racial logic, which we were convinced we had defeated, turns out to be alive and well. Their suffering simply doesn't matter in the face of the North's economic self-interest. As I see it, this is a mindset of extraction and exclusion that we will have to slay if we are to solve the twin challenges of both eradicating poverty and stopping climate change. So I'll leave that there and look forward to the conversation.
So those are two fantastic talks. I'm guessing there's going to be lots of questions. I'm just going to move it to the chair, and then we'll get straight into the questions. If you would like to start there. So I'm guessing, does anyone have any questions already? Or I suppose I can open up the door on my own if nobody's got any they want to start with. Okay, I'll let you all think a little bit. Okay, I'll start with one question on my own. So, yeah. So I'll direct a question predominantly to Dr. Fennell, So you opened by talking about something that like Asimoglu did. So in their studies of various development phenomena, they essentially used colonialism as a binary variable. They were countries that suffered colonialism or not. And this is obviously far too reductionist. But do you think there's actually any scope to reduce the colonial experiences of many different countries down to a few different variables, but which are common amongst many different countries? So that such analysis could be done validly without oversimplifying? Or do you think it's always going to be such a simplification that's more damaging to try and do that than not?
No, I don't think it's impossible for economists to be a bit more humble and to use colonial variables which are verified and validated by, say, historians or other in social science. What's particularly peculiar about the Asimoglu-Johnson-Robinson paper is the variable that they use is settler mortality. And the argument that they make is that countries where colonizing groups had very high mortality, they went for extractive forms. So this you pointed in very much in relation to Latin America. If you think of extraction, that's what Portuguese and Spanish meant for extraction of gold. And in more pleasant environments, where they had less mortality, like Kenya, they stayed. Now, it is true that settler mortality is an indicator, but why do the economists choose that? Because there's a data set. Why is there a data set? Because when you send people on a ship and they die, you have a measure. The missing data is how many, and you rightly put it, how many people, indigenous peoples in South America died because of the introduction of diseases that they were not immune from. So it's a data set, but it's not adequate just to say, oh, we've got a data set, let's run a regression. And that Asimoglu-Johnson-Robinson did raise a whole set of critiques by others, including Chris Bailey from Cambridge, and he wrote in his paper that if you want to compare colonialism, why don't you compare African and Asian? Try and look at country levels. Don't just look at regressions to see whether the data that you have across large data sets actually maps what's happening. So there's a recent paper by Tony Atkinson, which is far better. It looks at income inequality in the colonial period in a huge range of African countries for which you can now impute data. What the inequality was at the time when they became independent. And I was surprised, but pleasantly surprised, because of course it fit into my thesis, the argument that I'm making. And he said, actually, just before colonialism, the inequality in colonies reduced. Because they were transferring power from the white elite, whether it's English or French in the case of Anglophone or Francophone, to the indigenous elites. So inequality fell overall, but it got transferred from one elite group to the other. So for the native population, inequality was higher just after independence. Because like in the case of Kenya, you transfer from the white Kenyans to the Kikuyu, who are your chosen people. So if you look carefully at data constructions, we can do interesting work. But Atkinson very carefully is contained. He says, all I'm telling you is the relationship between tax revenues and inequality. And so you can have contained, you can't have these grand stories, but then the contained stories of Atkinson are not as sexy as the grand stories.
Do you have anything to add to that, Dr. Hickel, or it was mostly directed?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent answer. I concur.
Does anyone else have any questions on what's been presented, or just the topic more generally?
Or just your thoughts, actually. It's much more interesting to us. We, as lecturers, talk all the time, we know what you think.
Hi, I've heard that...
Please introduce yourself, since we don't know any of you, what subject you or anything, yeah.
So yeah, my name is Villa. I'm a historian, so it's still all very very interesting for me. But I've heard speaking to some of my friends who do development studies that the language of development can sound quite colonialist. And what you spoke about right now as well, Dr. Hickel, about IMF and the way they operate, it's pretty much clear. I was just wondering if you guys could comment on that. Like, does discourse somewhat resemble colonialist policy? A couple of decades back.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I guess the point I was trying to make was mostly just about the way the development discourse has kind of erased colonialist history from its statements, from its analysis. But I think you're right that there's something actually about some of these institutions that has a kind of colonial air to them. Like the IMF and the World Bank, for example, we know that voting power is deeply skewed in these institutions. Let's be honest, these are the key institutions of global economic governance. They virtually decide economic policy for the world, right? Especially for global South countries in particular, since they govern debt and finance. And they're controlled virtually entirely by a handful of rich countries. So the US has veto and has veto power, and the global South, which represents something like 80% of the world's population, has less than 50% of the votes. And there's no way that they can ever get their agenda passed or recognized. And so there's something about that suggests to me a kind of paternalism. Kind of like, you may think that what we're doing is bad, but in fact we know best. We have good economists that come from Cambridge and Oxford, et cetera. And that's, I think, is a problem. And if you travel around the global South and talk to people about development challenges, and ask them, what do they need most? Many people will tell you to your face that we actually don't want any more aid necessarily. What we would like is, in fact, just a fairer voice in the institutions of global governance. That's what global South countries have been asking for a very long time. And all that is given in return to that demand is essentially window dressing, like 0.5% shift in the voting share to China, for example, which doesn't actually change anything about the balance of power. So in that sense, I would see a kind of continuity with colonial thoughts.
If I could just add to that. So we forget that colonialism is not just located from what we call the global north. If you think about the world after 1945, it was divided up bizarrely between the colonizers and their colonies. And so the United States, you reorganize. The United States looks after South America, Europe looks after Africa, the UK, and Japan looks after Asia. And people forget that Japan was a powerful and probably one of the most extreme colonizers in a very short period. And so if you think about the world and the donor agencies that come out, then that whole language is about now it's a gentleman's agreement, we've moved into a dividend of peace, and now we're going to tell you how to develop. So it's not surprising that the language is that of we will now engage with you in a more gentlemanly way, we will give you technical aid, we will support, but you will develop in our wake and in our shadow and in our blueprint. And so when countries in Africa, for example, West Africa said to Canada, we're going for free trade, you get rid of your subsidies in cotton, we can trade. The Canadians went, no. The United States does the same thing. So they've got very high subsidies, and you don't have that for the African countries. So it's really, how can you expect the template that donor countries are telling developing countries to develop with when they don't have the same conditions and you deny them free trade while talking about it all the time?
So I think we'll take questions or points a couple at a time, and that might speed things a little bit. So I'll take those two first.
My name is Hayden. I study African politics as part of my degree. I was wondering if either of you could comment on the rise of China and the influence of China in African countries, and to what extent this kind of mirrors the colonial projects of the 20th century.
My name is Jakob, and I'm studying politics in first year. So maybe I'm just a bit naive, but when I came here...
all questions are good questions, so
no, because I think this narrative that the West is a bit hypocritical, well, not just the West, but the colonial states are hypocritical, is kind of well known. It's being taught in my lectures. I kind of knew it before. So what's the point? Is this new voice of the colonial states the goal in itself? Or do you think that development studies suggest any kind of solutions that can be found?
Okay, so go for the second question because remember it, then I'll try and remember the first question. Reverse order. So it's not that colonialism is not discussed in politics classrooms. It's colonialism is no longer discussed in economics classrooms. And many donors and international agencies tend to employ economists. The economic argument has tended to be that we've had 50 years of independence and national development. Then why do you blame the colonizers for what happens? And that's why I gave the example of education, because I'm saying there are long routes that affect even countries that think they're making independent policies because they're choosing policies that are provided by other framings. So what can development studies provide that's different? We can provide the possibility of looking at plurality as other ways. So people have talked about the East Asian model, China, I remember now. So Chinese model is one of those. The question that maybe African countries can choose, and in politics it's very contentious, can you have one-party democracy? Many East African countries have been arguing that multi-party democracy is the reason there's so much corruption, that they would be happy to have elections but from one party. These are forms of democracy that we in the West find odd. But really development is about nation states making decisions for themselves. And so what we're saying is plurality might be respected more, as in the case of the structural adjustment programs, where the donor agencies said, particularly the World Bank, that you've got a problem, you've got too much government, it's not doing enough investment. So we'll cut down. And what happened, I mean, bizarrely, what was interesting was the case of Ghana, which met every single conditionality requirement that the World Bank wrote out. And they were, the poster child, amazing, look at this country. And yet, urban poverty and rural poverty rose after the structural adjustment program. Unintended consequences, omission, the bank reconsidered, that's when it went to move towards a pro-poor strategy. So it's really about the sense of privilege that still comes from international institutions that you can tell other countries what to do. I think that's the point.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of people come back to me and say, oh, look, but, after the late 1990s, when the World Bank and IMF realized that structural adjustment had been such a disaster, even by their own standards, they had to back away from those policies. And so they replaced them with what they call poverty reduction strategy frameworks, PRSPs. But in reality, if you look at the content of these PRSPs, they're virtually exactly the same structural investment programs. The only difference is that they allow for social spending on healthcare and education, and they had to in order to meet to be consistent with the MDGs, which came out at the same time. But they're papered over with a much more humane kind of discourse. And crucially, they take away the problem of responsibility, right? So under the old structural adjustment programs, one of the key issues was that, look, if global south, if countries on which these SAPs are imposed end up failing and there's mass human suffering, does that make us as the World Bank liable, right? Now, fortunately for them, they have what's called sovereign immunity status, which means that even if you are in the global south and you decide to sue the IMF and the World Bank for destroying your economy, then you actually can't because they're immune from prosecution. Okay? But just to make sure, they switch their tactics so that now with the PRSPs, countries have to voluntarily write to the IMF and World Bank and say, these are the things we agree to before we even receive your demands. But everybody knows what's actually taking place here, right? So it's an elimination of liability, but the exact same policies are being pushed as conditions for finance.
Another China question. So what do we think of China and Africa? It's an interesting scenario. So now you have more than one type of donor aid going into Africa. And initially when Chinese aid came into Africa, there was a lot of hullabaloo from Western powers saying, oh, this is aid which is not going to be supporting democracy because it has no strings, and it's a new form of imperialism. Let's just step back and say, well, what did Western powers do for the preceding 50 years? Structural adjustment was that's a form of conditionality. So if Western powers do believe indeed that China is providing a new form of imperialism, they need to change their donor policies as well. If they are truly unconditional, then African countries have a choice between providers. So that's one part. The other part, what is China doing? Yes, China is doing infrastructure building, it's building roads. African countries need roads. You put it so poignantly, the only thing that Africa had is railways, and that when they all went to the ports and everything went out. So There's an unmet need in Africa, which the Chinese are meeting. Of course, the challenge is, are the Chinese going to invest in African labour force? In the global labour force argument, the skills in Africa are low and they're a young population, they need skills. So that's a different set of questions. But to sort of say, oh, China's the bad guy, therefore we are the good guys, is very naive and simplistic. The reality is, there needs to be far more thought in terms of how engagement occurs and whether African countries, in this case, have the capacity to write the contracts. In fact, as China did when it got joint ventures in the 80s and 90s. They had contracts with Western companies to have technology transfer. And that's what African countries need as well.
I think it's a really good question. I guess the only thing I would add is that, and I suppose we're kind of waiting to see how things play out. Like in South Africa right now, there's a big discussion about will BRICS turn out to be a kind of sub-imperial force of some kind, right? Especially with respect to the kind of finance they give. There's going to be a BRICS bank, and they're going to give development finance as kind of an alternative to the World Bank, right? Is that going to come along with structural adjustment conditions that are going to serve the interests of BRICS countries? We don't know that yet. But what's interesting is that if you look back to the 1970s, when global South countries were rallying around this idea of the new international economic order, which they presented to the UN. What they were actually asking for there was a system of finance that would be under the UN and therefore collectively ratified by democratic mechanisms and fair. And maybe that's the alternative we need to press to the BRICS Bank and Chinese development banks and so on is a fairer mechanism of surplus recycling that isn't going to be as destructive as structural investment has been. And instead of criticizing China for sub-imperialist policies, maybe the option, our best option is to create an alternative that will be more even.
You have more questions? You're familiar with the I'll take you to that.
My name is Jessica. I'm reading for a PhD in Latin American Studies. And so I was just wondering because like the political rhetoric in the US and in the UK, for instance, has been very much against trade policies and anti-globalization. And so it's taking a very inward-looking position, I guess, similar to what you were talking about Latin America in the 60s or 70s, where they were trying to foster their national industries. But it's interesting that's coming now from the metropolis who has benefited so much from those dynamics that tended to sell raw materials to more industrialized countries to transform them and then sell them more expensive to those countries. So I was just wondering, like, what do you think is the logic behind that, and how do you think that will play out in current politics?
Do you find that the tactics of debt restructure and extraction have become internalized to the West itself, in terms like Greece or big countries, or austerity as well, in terms of privatization and things and extracting wealth from those in the UK economy?
Yeah, to me that comparison is evidence. And the only person I've seen make that argument actually is Ha-Joon Chang, in an article maybe last year, I forget. But his point was, look, we're all very shocked about what's happening to Greece right now. But if you were paying attention to world history over the past 50 years, then this would seem a familiar story, right? Because the exact same policies were visited upon the global south for the exact same reasons, to bail out banks basically by imposing austerity. And so we shouldn't be surprised, and the same things are going to happen in terms of the kind of political instability that led to across the global south. We're going to see the same happen in Europe. What's interesting to me is to think about how, like, in the past, Europe thought of the rest of the world as a sacrifice zone, right? With structural adjustment, for example. As long as these policies didn't harm Europe, then things were fine. But now Europe, the elites of Europe are actually willing, bizarrely, in my mind, to create sacrifice zones in their own space, right? And that, to me, is like a complete transformation of the way that national interest has been conceived. And to me, this represents a very problematic kind of political capture. Such that you're willing to immiserate a whole portion of your own population for the sake of bailing out the banks, which you would never have done before. You would have immiserated brown people, but that's to them okay in the past. So that's quite interesting.
I'd go back to make the comparison a little bit further, ask the question of why Europe in the post-war period was willing to make a larger concession to a larger group of people, and then compare that with the early nationalism that occurred in the rest of the world. Creating national boundaries for peace is very powerful. It really is the ephemeral, incredible power of nationalism. And so, after the war, in Europe, the need to build a peace and to create some larger identity which prevented further war meant that the welfare state was very powerful. And actually, in many developing countries, that is part of the discussion. The reason that you talk about development is to provide income and then later health and education. But they've broken down in a similar fashion. And the reason they've broken down, one, is inequality. You know, people say forget these numbers are right or wrong, but I think he's absolutely correct when he says, look at the increase in inequality. And the increase in inequalities occurred in high-income countries, the GDPs have gone up, and also in the middle-income countries in the BRICS. And when that happens, the bottom half complains in a way, because for 2 generations, as we saw with the young rural Pakistanis, saying, we waited. How much longer can we wait? So I think your question is very valid, and I think if the current wave of austerity in Europe doesn't get us to think as intellectuals, as academics, and then to go out there and do that kind of research, then the next shock's going to be worse. There's another question we can hear from
there's a question about Trump's policies on trade. So first of all, I'm not at all convinced that Trump is able to follow through on anything he promises. And so I think only time will tell what he's going to do with trade. I would not be surprised at all if he decided to sell his own supporters down the river when it comes to this and back out of his claims on that. But what's really important is that the U.S. is only able to become autonomous to a certain kind of extent, right? So it's a massive consumer nation, and we know that in terms of ecological capacity, it consumes something like 4 or 5 times more than it actually has, right? In terms of its land base, in terms of its resources, in terms of its pollution. And so there's going to be, if you want to maintain the so-called American lifestyle, then the only way to operate is by plundering ecological capacity from other countries. And so yes, you may change trade rules to some extent, but the basic idea of the U.S. sucking resources from the rest of the world will have to remain in place. And I guess the question is, like, can he manage the maintenance of that system, or will he somehow unwittingly cause it to fall apart? I guess, yeah, we'll see.
So I would think that there's something in terms of what you were asking as well. Can we learn from the current conundrums we're in? I think the rise of Trump also makes you think about where else there are possible drivers for seeing alternative paradigms. And I say, for me, one is ECLA. I mean, that in Latin America is a powerful driver looking at alternative policies. It has helped a country like Argentina to think through, to come back. You know, repeatedly people say it's a basket case. Some very powerful notions of change that have come out. Difficult, but change. Or, and again, I think this was bizarre 20 years ago when China was seen as the polluter, but China probably has, like some other countries have in the Global South, discussions about climate change. And it's really interesting now to see China turn to the United States as you've got to ensure you don't renege. So in a bizarre way, what we're getting out of this is not a comfortable plurality, but kind of pointed reminders that there are alternative paradigms that we could develop.
I think we'll probably have just enough time for 2 more questions. We do have to be out at 7 though, so 2 more. I'll take these 2. Sorry.
I studied development studies, master's here. I have a question about whether we can apply the framework of post-colonialism in the local context. So far we talk about international context, north-south, but my question is primarily focused on Mamdani. He gives a concept of bifurcated states, so at least in Africa, these 2 legal systems that work together. You both discuss the agents, so the colonialists and the colonized, but I'm more interested in seeing whether there are more agents in the local context, so the chiefs and the elites in the colonial state, which suppress the rest of the society. Do you see this framework working today? So it's not. I'm asking whether it's not just the North and South relationship, which is very unequal, but actually within the countries, so the post-colonial state within the country.
Yeah.
It's a question.
My question was, parts of the presentation made it sound like former colonies would be forever doomed to be determined by their colonial past. So do you think there's a possible breakthrough, or is that just going to be the future forever? And are there any counter examples of some former colonies who have managed to break free from that legacy?
Yeah, those are excellent points and questions. To the point about Mamdani and indirect rule, and sort of and buying out local chiefs and headmen who will then, I guess, kind of impose this colonial logic on your behalf. I think that's absolutely present today, and you're completely right. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of power relations to talk about a strict north-south divide anymore. It's possible that in the 50s and 60s, and even the 70s, you couldn't make that argument. When the third world movement was ascendant, and you had very strong leaders from these developmentalist economies who were arguing for South solidarity. That, to the most part, has just kind of fallen apart, and to me, it's very sad. I mean, there's some kind of discussion among some more radical leaders that we need to get together and form better cartels, demand reformation of the UN, etc. But for the most part, like a lot of these global South leaders have been very effectively bought off and consensed into the neoliberal order. And we're quite happy to continue imposing those policies on their own people because it benefits the elite that keep them in power. And so, absolutely, I think that's really crucial to understand.
Would you blame them more than the global north, or in the sense the elite of the global north? Do they have more power in that sense, or the main agents of this unequal distribution of inequalities actually within the local context?
Yeah, I'm not sure I could say I would blame one more than the other necessarily. I mean, clearly it's kind of a partnership of inequity of power. Yeah, but that's interesting to think about. To this point about are global South countries doomed? Is there possibility for breakthrough? I think that actually there are interesting things that are beginning to emerge now. So if you look at like Bolivia and Ecuador, these are not great examples necessarily, but what's interesting is they have recently taken the opportunity to draw from a kind of indigenous intellectual heritage and enshrine the idea of, say, the rights of nature and via into their constitutions as an alternative to the Western development model of endless exponential GDP growth, which we all know is complete madness, right? So maybe they're not the best examples of actually implementing that, but we do have examples like Costa Rica and Bhutan, which are definitely thinking along those lines, trying to imagine their way out of a very constrictive, normative idea of development, and offer an alternative to the world. And these ideas are actually gaining traction really rapidly across the global set. So I think there's some hope there. I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, so I think sometimes we don't look hard enough at countries that are trying to come out of difficulties. A country that I've begun working in was Rwanda, where it comes out of a terrible past, but it's moved to a 6 to 7% rate of growth. It's actually used local courts, the Gacaca courts, to replace the very long, protracted process of international negotiation to try and get legal reform, to try and see that perpetrators, and when you travel there are people working and there are people who are doing their labor camp work as a consequence of being the perpetrators. And everywhere there's somebody who has either been hurt or a perpetrator. Very difficult terrain, and yet they are so keen to build that nation. A student of mine who's finishing her PhD, she calls it homegrown solutions. It's a difficult territory, but you've got to go forward. We don't like those because we come with trappings of, we need to see the state develop and then change. But given the very difficult context of countries, another case that might be interesting to look at are countries in Southeast Asia. They, again, are living in a difficult terrain. They've got big players like China, Laos, Cambodia. Which way they go? Do they go for a semi-state economy on this? But growth rates are increasing. Again, first question on history is a good one. I mean, we are so inured to the idea there's one particular template for development. And yet, when we look at growth rates of the other characteristics under, we go, no, that's not really the rate of growth. People say the same thing about South Korea in the 80s. No, that's not growth, that's corruption. But think about things in a slightly different way. Then you might come to the point about local elites versus global elites. I think if we could get data on global assets and inequalities, you'd probably find a closening between what national elites in the BRICS countries get in terms of their incomes with global elites over the last 30 years. So they're becoming more like, not a single class, but a single, at least, configuration with a single narrative of privatization and neoliberal growth. And then the others, whether they're in the high-income countries and getting left behind, or in the low-income countries. And a particular figure that comes to mind is that 70% of the poverty, if maybe 50 to 70% of the poverty, but at least 50% of poverty, is going to be in middle-income countries by 2050. That's talking about what's happening.
So I think we only have to wrap it up there. That's partly my fault. I was slow getting it started. If we could have one last big round of applause for both of us.